The spread of the coronavirus has passed a significant milestone in just the past few minutes. According to the Johns Hopkins University, which has become a recognised source of information in this crisis, there are now more than 1 million confirmed cases worldwide, although the true number could be much higher. The global death toll has passed 50,000 people. The UK wants to test 100,000 people a day by the end of April. Spain has registered 950 coronavirus deaths in just one single day. This is the highest daily number anywhere in the world. And in Russia, President Putin has extended the country's partial lockdown until the end of April. The coronavirus crisis generates new and shocking numbers every day. But one figure released earlier about the effect on the US economy really stands out. Unemployment claims there have surged to a record-breaking 6.6 million. That is on top of the previous week's record of nearly 3.3 million. Well, here's the Nobel Prize-winning economist Paul Krugman.
Over the past 2 weeks, 10 million new claims, which is 20 times what you'd normally expect to see over that period. And that's not catching all of the people who are losing their jobs either. So we've already, in the past 2 weeks, lost more jobs than we lost in the Great Recession. It's unbelievable. First phase is what I'm calling the corona coma. It's like putting people in a medically induced coma so that they can heal from severe injury. And that's necessary, but the problem is to avoid hardship, to provide enough aid to people whose incomes have disappeared. Then there's a substantial risk that as time goes by, you get a conventional recession on top of that, because you have all of these people without income, all of these businesses without sales who are unable to spend. And so even businesses that are not on lockdown suffer a big loss of sales, and that could persist for a long time.
Well, there are likely to be more US job losses to come, with the plane maker Boeing, a symbol of the US manufacturing industry, outlining a huge voluntary redundancy plan for many of its 150,000 strong workforce. Its boss, David Calhoun, said that it's important that we start adjusting to our new reality now. He added that the world emerges from this pandemic, the size of the commercial market will likely be different. Well, the company's also calling for a $60 billion bailout package from the US government. And this is why Boeing is struggling. More than 100 countries, all shown in red on this map, have introduced travel restrictions because of coronavirus. Well, let's turn to Europe now, because Spain's unemployment figures for March have just been released as well. The country recorded its highest monthly increase ever. The number of jobless jumped 9.3% from the previous month. The total number of unemployed people in Spain is now around 3.5 million. The European Union is proposing a €100 billion rescue package for countries hardest hit by the virus. Well, the initiative is called SURE, which stands for Support to Mitigate Unemployment Risks in an Emergency. Here's the President of the European Commission on this.
It can mitigate the effects of the recession. It keeps people in work. It enables companies to return to the market with renewed vigor. The Commission will provide loans to those member states that need them to strengthen their short-time work schemes. These schemes now exist and are planned straight across the European Union, so SURE can benefit all member states who want to use it.
So it's obvious that the economic impact on the world from coronavirus is absolutely huge, with those figures of people who are losing their job increasing. Of course, we're monitoring that continuously on BBC News. A welcome to our viewers in the UK. We're going to stay on the economic impact of the coronavirus because our business correspondent Michelle Fleury joins us from New York. Michelle, we're going to start with the United States because the figures there, after the record-breaking figures that we already saw about people claiming unemployment, once again, that huge increase.
Yeah, I mean, this was an astonishing number. You have to remember that 1 week ago, we were talking about 3.3 million Americans filing for unemployment benefits. At the time, we were talking about that as record-breaking. Yet just 7 days later, the figure has doubled to 6.6 million. And if you take the total, we're talking about roughly 10 million Americans over a 2-week period that have lost their jobs. It is unprecedented, the magnitude and the speed with which firms here are shedding workers. And that, I think, it sort of helps underscore the catastrophic effect this pandemic is having here on the American economy, but also we're seeing that repeated in other countries around the world. And it is, just to put it in context for you, when you look back to the 2008 recession, in America there were roughly 9 million jobs lost. Now we're talking about 10 million in just 2 weeks.
The figures are staggering. We say this so often. When it comes to Europe as well, the continent very badly hit as well now with coronavirus. Talk us through how Europe is comparing.
Yeah, I mean, Italy and Spain are obviously the two countries that economists are talking about the most as having been at the epicenter of Europe's coronavirus pandemic. I mean, in Italy, you know, the numbers people are talking about, again, they're saying to sort of benchmark it to the 2008 recession, which is what many people still remember, they're saying this could be 2 times worse than what that was like for Italy. It gives you a sense of scale, of the depth of the problem, and that's why policymakers are really scrambling to try and address this in different ways. And we're seeing in the US, obviously, they're signing a relief aid, and in your introduction you mentioned what Europe is doing with the SURE Act, trying to come together. In the UK, of course, we've seen efforts there with money being given to companies to try and keep people on the payroll.
And when it comes to this European Union proposed package, this initiative which is called SURE, how is it being received by member states?
Yeah. Well, I think the test will come next Tuesday, and that is when finance ministers have to approve this. There's optimism that there is enough of a consensus to get this done. But again, I hate to keep going on about 2008, but that is sort of where people are looking. And at the time, the question was, could the EU member states all come together and act as one? And they did a pretty good job. But there was a question about solidarity, and it's being revealed yet again now. Just last week, there was an issue about whether or not they might issue something called coronavirus bonds backed by EU member countries. There was disagreement. You had stronger economies like Germany unwilling to essentially act as a backstop for what has long been perceived as countries like Italy and Spain that have weaker economic fundamentals. And those tensions, we're seeing those on display again. That's why this will be a key test of how well they can come together. And I think many economists will see this as a good first step if they can get it done.
Yes, a huge key test there. Our thanks to Michelle Fleury for talking through the huge economic impact of coronavirus. The British government here in the UK has again been defending the lack of testing of NHS frontline workers as this pandemic continues. The Health Secretary confirmed that just 5,000 NHS frontline staff have been tested. That is only a tiny fraction of the 500,000 frontline workforce. Currently, there are around 10,000 tests which are being carried out a day. Hospital patients are being prioritised over health workers. Today, Matt Hancock set a target to carry out 100,000 coronavirus tests a day in England by the end of April. Here's our political editor, Laura Koonsberg.
Nicola and her husband are both GPs in Cheshire, both stuck at home, both have been unwell. But with no tests, they don't know, they can't know if they've had the virus or not, and can't go back to work.
I just can't see that this is right. We're both keen to work, we're both desperate to work, and as with most GPs, we would work through a minor illness. We don't take time off lightly.
After days of accusations of missing targets and mishandling, the Health Secretary, just back at work after the virus himself, is trying to show the government is getting a grip.
I understand why NHS staff want tests so they can get back to the front line. Of course I do. But I took the decision that the first priority has to be the patients for whom the result of a test could be the difference in treatment that is the difference between life and death.
He called on business to help, outlined nationwide sampling and eventually an antibody test that could diagnose big chunks of the population. But tests for health workers are what matter here and now.
I am now setting the goal of 100,000 tests per day by the end of this month. That is the goal, and I am determined that we will get there.
Can you give us a firm date by when any NHS staff that needs a test will get a test? Because in a fast-moving crisis like this, the end of the month is still a long time away.
I'm delighted that we've now managed to test 5,000 NHS staff. I will, over the coming weeks, seek to ensure that every NHS frontline staff member who needs a test gets one.
Remember, there are two kinds of test. One to show if you've had the virus after recovering, but the one these NHS staff are queuing up for at a Superstore car park turned testing drive-through records if you have the virus right now. If the drivers of these cars are negative, they could get back onto the desperately stretched wards as doctors and nurses. That's why it's so urgent now.
It's very frustrating. We should be the first so that we can look after our patient. I'm very sad.
It's quite efficient and it allows us to go back to work as soon as we could, really. So that's the best thing we could possibly do for our NHS staff, to be honest.
Privately, the government admits it's been slow to make this happen. Testing has become the most acute political problem in this crisis, with the senior Labour MP Dawn Butler, who lost her uncle to the disease, in grief and anger, insisting the government needs to test everyone who works in hospitals without delay.
We're going to need a strategy for community-based testing for really the majority of the population over time, because that is the route out of lockdown.
But a former cabinet secretary, no stranger to managing crises, suggests there might be deeper roots to the problem.
Does it seem to you, though, that the government was too slow?
I think when we look back on it, and I think all of us should take a share of the blame here, pandemics, even in my time, was top of the risk register. Did we do enough to build spare capacity? Did we do enough to think that through and actually get the materials in hand, have enough ventilators, have enough protective equipment? Probably not. So, but let's not worry too much about the mistakes of the past.
Even if testing centres become a familiar sight, with no cure, no government can make coronavirus go away. But the actions they take can make a difference to how it affects us all. Laura Kunsberg, BBC News.
We hear so much about testing, so how many tests has the UK carried out? 163,000 tests for this virus, which works out as roughly 245 people in every 100,000 being tested here in the UK. And how does that compare to other nations? It's always worth having a look at how other countries are doing it. Denmark, for example, the number of tests per 100,000 is more than that. It's 515. Germany, over double, just double that. 1,000 tests being done per 100,000, but lagging behind the UK and most other nations is France, where you can see the test rate is just 160,000 per 160, in fact, per 100,000. So many figures when it comes to this story. We're going to cross over to our political correspondent, Lena Nathu, who's in Westminster for us. When it comes to the testing in the UK, we heard from the Health Secretary that that number will, he hopes, increase by 100,000, up to 100,000.
That's right. He set out this goal by the end of the month. He wants to get daily testing up to 100,000. Remember, it's sort of hovering at about the 10,000 mark at the moment, certainly below where officials, ministers themselves say they wanted to be. We heard an ambition to get up to 25,000 tests a day previously. Boris Johnson had mentioned a target of 250,000. He had used that figure previously with no timescale. But today, Matt Hancock said he wanted to be realistic about what could be achieved. He had to really answer the question as to why the government had been so slow. He set out, he tried to explain that a little bit, talking about the fact we didn't have the kind of laboratory capacities such as Germany, those sorts of things, a shortage of chemicals and testing kits, that some kits that are being proposed to him don't actually have the accuracy that would be required. So he set out to try and explain why the UK is where it is, but then set out this goal which the government will be judged on. But let's not forget, the end of April, this goal, 100,000 tests a day, is a long way away. So there is still still a lot that can happen. Remember, we're only at the start of the month. And I think that we will have to see, how the government is going to deliver that. They're talking about scaling up existing NHS laboratory capacity. They're talking about testing in the community as a sort of representative sample. They're talking about bringing in private providers. So yes, he set out this goal, but clearly the priority at the moment is to get NHS capacity up to its maximum by letting NHS staff be tested, so those who are self-isolated because they or their family members have symptoms can get back to work. So a lot really in there today, but the 100,000 is clearly the number that Matt Hancock wanted to give as the government's commitment to get that testing rate up.
Yeah, and crucial to get those NHS, those frontline staff tested. When it comes to this whole issue, it is becoming incredibly emotive. Of course, people understandably scared, but it's also becoming political, with the opposition Labour Party becoming increasingly vocal about this.
Yeah, I mean, at the start, if you sort of rewind to the start of this outbreak in the UK, there was a bit of a political consensus that there was an emergency facing the country, and, opposition parties here were not really breaking ranks, just keen to sort of support the government, work with the government. But this issue of testing has been a very, very pressing one, and something that Labour has been talking about. And, they're broadly welcoming this ambition to get to 100,000. They're saying, look, we need the detail. But I think the issue of testing speaks to sort of various points in this. It goes back to right at the beginning. Was the government too slow to act in the first place? Why wasn't testing employed sort of aggressively and very widely at the beginning, like some other countries have done? Why now can NHS staff not get the test now in order to get back to work, those who are off with symptoms or self-isolating? And what will be the strategy in the future? So this is something that Labour are talking about, the fact that they see that mass testing in the community will be the route out of these restrictions. So you can only release these restrictions if you get community testing, and this idea of testing for people who've had the disease so you can get an idea of the spread. That is the way out of the restrictions. So I think the testing issue speaks to various points in this crisis, and it's something that has caused the opposition parties to sort of criticise the government on.
Yeah, we're seeing that definitely. Layla, thanks as always. Layla Nathoo there in Westminster. Well, I want to turn away from the UK for the moment, because Spain has reached its own grim milestone, 950 coronavirus deaths in one single day. This is the highest daily number anywhere in the world, in fact. And for Spain, it's the 6th day in a row that the daily death toll has risen above 800. More than 10,000 people have now died in Spain. And just take a look at the figures for France. The death toll there passing 4,500, and there have been almost 14,000 deaths in Italy, from where our Europe correspondent Mark Lowen reports from Rome.
Hoping for a sign of life. When the disease hits, it decimates. Fighting it demands precision and speed to cope with these numbers. This is one of Spain's biggest hospitals, Vall d'Hebron in Catalonia, but it could be anywhere else that the virus has struck, for this is its hallmark, to plunder a country, overwhelming its hospitals. The doctor shows just one of the patients here needing assisted ventilation. There are 200 in this intensive care unit. Catalonia, Spain's wealthiest region, is at its limit. Look how vulnerable we are when it hits, a complex living soul stripped bare, lying face down to help clear the lungs, a basic technique to battle a stronger killer. Spain, as elsewhere, is short of supplies for its medics, who make up around 15% of all cases. They try to prepare for the front line, but nurses like Joanna say it's taking its toll.
Emotionally, it's also hard because you're worried for yourself, for your own safety, you're worried for your patients, you're worried for your families. Lots of people have relatives or friends who are at home who are unwell, so, it's quite stressful.
After a record daily rise in deaths, Spain says it is now flattening the curve. The infection rate is reducing, but it won't be quick. Nor will it in France, where deaths there have now jumped to more than 4,000. A specialist plane was configured to transfer the sickest to Germany for treatment, European states using every tool at their disposal. Germany, with far fewer deaths of its own, also took in patients from Italy, the critically ill loaded into air ambulances. A virus that knows no borders is taking a worldwide effort to confront it. Mark Lowen, BBC News, Rome.
Now let's turn to Syrian refugee camps across the Middle East. They are bracing themselves for this pandemic. Millions of people have, of course, been displaced by that 9-year conflict in Syria. Many of them are now in camps in Syria's northern Idlib province or in Jordan or Lebanon. Last week, the UN and International Committee of the Red Cross called for an immediate ceasefire. They said that we cannot fight two battles at the same time. Well, the BBC's Karin Torby has been speaking to Syrian refugees. This is a little of her report.
A new threat haunts millions weary of running from Syria's brutal conflict.
يعني هسه فوق هالأسى اللي جانا وهالضرب وهالنزوح هسه الله بعث لنا هالبلاء هذا.
إذا صار في حالة واحدة بمخيم الزعتري مصابة بفيروس كورونا فعدد كبير رح يصاب بهذا المرض.
أنا عديت أنا وما عندي مثلا خبر بهالشيء هذا عديت المخيم كله.
Overcrowded camps now look almost deserted. For the moment, those in Lebanon, Jordan and Syria have escaped the pandemic. But for how long? Khalid fled Syria 6 years ago with his mother and sons. They are following instructions from the Lebanese authorities. They don't leave their camp unless necessary. He sent us this video from Arsal on the border between Lebanon and Syria. We reached out to him via Skype to avoid any risk of contamination.
في مي متوفرة المي مطلوب منا انه الاولاد نغسل ايديهم عم يجوا الاولاد يطلعوا نقول الولد غسل ايديك وعم نرجع لما اشوف الولد انه عم بحط على ايديه صابون فعم نلوم الولد كمان ما عم نستنى نخلي الولد يكفي فالعالم ما نشوف على التليفونات وعلى التلفزيون انه لازم يحط معقم وديتول نحن هذا كله مفتقرين وما عندنا ولا نهائيا بكل المخيمات يعني.
UN agencies are trying to help by handing out larger water rations and setting up isolation tents. They also pledge to cover tests and treatment. But here in northwestern Syria, it's a different story. There is no national authority in Idlib to coordinate a response for the hundreds of thousands of displaced Syrians living in these overcrowded camps. Local agencies are helping spread awareness, but water is scarce and disinfectants are in short supply.
المنطقة 30 كيلومتر ب 30 كيلومتر فيها 4 مليون. إذا انتشر هذا الفيروس بهذه المنطقة راح تصير كارثة إنسانية في هذه المنطقة.
Just weeks ago, much of Idlib was a war zone. People here are still in fear of the shelling. And now they are also afraid of a new and different kind of death. Karin Torbey, Lebanon.